Hello, everybody. Do you have negative thoughts about yourself because of negative messages you grew up listening to? If so, this conversation with Dr. Kira Banks should be of high interest to you. I ran across an article she wrote about healing racial oppression that we have bought into and immediately reached out to her to invite her to this podcast. Kira co-founded the Institute for Healing, Justice, and Equity, where she is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology. She has published over 20 articles in peer-reviewed outlets and has her PhD from the University of Michigan in clinical psychology. Today, she has a podcast, Raising Equity, to support adults in talking to kids about systems of oppression. And she continues to do research in this area. Hope you enjoy it. Here is Dr. Banks. So, hello, everybody. I am totally delighted to bring to you Kira Banks, Dr. Kira Banks. I discovered her in an article that she wrote in an academic journal about the ACT therapy and internalized oppression. So those are a lot of words. We'll break it down in a minute. Dr. Banks co-founded Racial Healing, Justice, and Equity at St. Louis University. She's an associate professor there. She's published over 20 articles. She's a smart lady. She's got she graduated Phi Beta Kappa, and from the University of Michigan, she has a podcast called Raising Equity, which focuses on talking to adults, helping to support adults in talking to kids about systems of oppression. So what we're going to talk about is internalized oppression and this therapeutic technique known as ACT, acceptance commitment therapy. So first, before we get started on going into that, let's find out about you. When did you first become aware of race?
Oh, I believe I was aware of my race from a really young age, probably primary school. So I was in a Montessori school, so that was preschool. When I was 3, 4, I knew that I was a different race than other people in my class.
Was there one or two, or were there, how many were in your class? How many people of color?
Right. So being a Montessori, it was multi-age. And so there were 1 or 2 other kids of color in the range of students that were in the class. And my sister was in another classroom in the same school. But in the school overall, there were not very many kids of color. It was a predominantly white school.
Okay. So you grew up as a minority, basically.
I did. I grew up as a numerical minority. My parents we were very connected to both of our extended families. Both of my parents are Black. And so we were over at my grandparents' house every Sunday, sometimes both sets of grandparents. So I was very connected with my Blackness in terms of my family. But yes, the community where we lived, where I went to school, where I did extracurricular activities was predominantly white.
Okay. So fast us forward to how you discovered race and ACT and internalized oppression as something to study. What motivated you to even choose this?
Well, gosh, okay, that's a big fast forward, because I would say I became first interested in racial identity development. And so how people think about themselves in terms of race was something that was interesting to me, partly because of my lived experience being Black in a predominantly white space, knowing that I was Black, but knowing that other people had different ideas about what that should mean or what that did mean. And so I've always been interested in racial identity development. I didn't have words for that until I went to Mount Holyoke College and met Beverly Daniel Tatum, who wrote Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and Other Conversations About Race.
Yes, ma'am. I taught that for years.
Yep. So she was my mentor at Mount Holyoke in undergrad.
Oh,
And so,
wow.
yeah, it was
What?
before she wrote the book, but she was teaching psychology of racism, which she has taught since the 80s. And I was a TA for her class. She introduced me to racial identity theory. Bill Cross, who is the kind of one of the grandfathers of
Right.
racial identity development theory, was at UMass Amherst down the road. I met him. So like she introduced me to the theory of racial identity. And if you look in the back of the first edition of the book, you'll see my name.
Whoa.
Um,
Okay, so I'm people are going to wonder what is racial identity development theory. I would love to have you back to talk exclusively about that. Can you summarize in one sentence what that is, just so that we aren't tantalizing people?
yeah, it's how people make sense and make meaning of race.
Okay, good enough.
It's that
Okay,
simple.
okay,
Yeah.
so keep going.
So racial identity development was an interest of mine. And a component of racial identity development that people often talk about is that some people, and everyone to some extent, might internalize or appropriate some of the negative myths and lies they get told about, in my case, Black folks, that racism tells us about who we are, right? So if we understand that racial identity is how you think about yourself in terms of race and your identity, and it's in the context of racism, racism tells us lies and myths about who we are. It even tells white folks lies and myths about who they are. Those lies and myths just tell them they're superior. The lies and myths for Black folks tell you you're less than, you're deficient. Folks of color, similar, but sometimes distinct messages. And so there's this piece that would say you internalize those messages, and that's called internalized racism. But I actually don't like that term because it means like it's in you. And I actually like the term appropriated racial oppression because that means you could pick it up. And that also might help us think about it as something we can put down. Whereas when it's in us, I don't know, I'm a psychologist. I'm not good at surgery, but I am good at interrupting behavior. So that's what led me to think about, could we do an intervention that would interrupt that appropriation of these ideas and myths and lies?
Okay, so let's be real. Let's give some concrete examples here of what appropriated internalized racial oppression. That's a lot of words. So I'm just still going to say internalized racism. What that looks and feels like. So I grew up on these jokes. I'll just give myself first. I grew up on jokes, the white man, the Indian, and the Negro. So the white man did the right thing, the Indian did a less savory thing, and the Negro messed it all up, screwed it all up. I grew up on a dozen of those jokes. And so for me, the contradiction for me was I was smart, but I was supposed to be less smart than white people, but I was smart. So, figuring all of that out was the challenge for me. That's my example. What about for you?
Yeah, so for me, I think it was that I was going to be found out, like not that special. And so it fits and it's connected to what you're talking about in a bit, like that I'm incompetent. And so, oh, I'm doing well, but that's because they assume less of Black folks. And when they really find out, right? I will be seen as not as competent, as not as intelligent. So what's interesting is there's that common theme of lack of intelligence, lack of competence. And that is a major myth and lie that is told about Black people.
Yes, and that some of us get pounded into us, as you put it, it gets appropriated into us, whether we want to or not.
Oh, well, Beverly Tatum.
Yes.
Dr. Beverly Tatum, so Tatum, she talks about these messages and narratives being like smog in the air. So if they're like smog in the air, we're all breathing. So it's not like, oh, you aren't breathing it, but I am. We all are. And so we have to be honest about the air we're breathing in, the fact that we might cough up some of that smog, and then it's all of our responsibility to clean it up.
Okay, so you are describing the imposter syndrome is what happened to you. I'll be found out. And we did a blog post about that previously, and I'm just referencing that. I'll link to that post below. So you had this. So how long did you keep this?
Oh, I'm still battling it.
Okay.
It's not gone. I haven't gone to another planet. Like, I'm
Okay.
still getting the messages. So I still have to, block and reframe and talk to myself and engage in what ACT would say, the cognitive diffusion, so that I don't see those ideas as fused with who I am. I
Right.
see them as content, not content of like who I am, but context of like what's around me. So it's work.
When you say it's work, literally, how often do you find yourself having to battle? Is this a daily thing, weekly, monthly?
Are we doing therapy?
No, but people, I'm talking to
I'm
people.
teasing. I'm
Okay.
teasing. And
People
I
want
just
to
say that.
know. People
Yes,
want
no,
to know that they are not unusual. So that's what
that's why I joke, right?
okay.
Because
Okay.
I want to be clear that like we all have this work to do. So I am quite successful. I, have a PhD and by all sorts of things, right? Like I shouldn't have this thought that I'm going to be found out, and I still have to navigate it. So, I mean, it several times a week. I don't
Okay.
know if it's daily
That's good
now.
enough.
At one point it was daily, right? And when you're kind of in that climbing mode of your life, where whether you're achieving or you're going for something, it's that sort of, those messages in the world can be like those whispers in your ear of like who do you think you are? Like, are you sure? Right. And so there were times when I was climbing, I think I might have had to battle it more. Not that I'm still not growing, because I'm not done growing, but I do think it's less than it was in the past. But that's taken intentional work, and not just like denying that it exists and saying I'm not gonna think about it, like stick my fingers in my ear, like la la la, but naming it and challenging it.
Okay. So for me, so that there's two of us and people understand this, for me, I no longer think I'm not good enough for what I'm doing, but I'm not good enough for what I want to do. And so I'm battling on how can I really do what I'm aiming to do? And am I really good enough? And so I go through that same thing of questioning it. And I know it traces way back to segregated schools that I was raised in, where the white students had the benefits and we got the hand-me-down. So I can trace it for me. I'm in a different generation, so I can see that.
But isn't it
Okay.
powerful though, how we're in different generations and yet the stories are so similar?
It's just amazing to me because I remember the one day we will be free. I grew up on the one day myth. And so it's better than it was when I was a child, for sure. I'm not. I can go and drink out of any water fountain I please that's open to the public. So that's better. But we there's a lot of people still in segregation. There are a lot of people who are battling, and the people who listen to this podcast are people in organizations who are wanting to do more, achieve more, and who are secretly, a number of them, I know for a fact, are secretly wondering, am I up to? And so this is why it was so important for you to be here. Okay, so you've explained internalized oppression. Say that how you would prefer to say it again.
I refer to it as appropriated oppression. And I like it.
Oh, that's two words. I can hang with that.
Yeah. I know people know it as internalized oppression or internalized racism, but I like appropriated. I really do. Because think about it. Like, you can appropriate, and not in people know cultural appropriation, not in that sense, but when you appropriate something, you pick it up. And so if as I'm picking, like I'm picking up my phone or a cup or something, right? If we think about it as external to us, something that's happening external to us, we can interrupt that. I can put my phone down. I can set limits on how often I engage with it or how I engage with it. If we only think about it as something that's in us, how do we get something out of us? that to me, it takes away our agency, and it takes away some of our ability to interrupt it. So all that to say, that's appropriated racism. And when I learned about ACT, one of the core ideas of acceptance commitment therapy is this idea of cognitive diffusion. So basically,
wait, before you say those two words very slowly.
Yes.
Cognitive, what's the second word?
Diffusion.
Okay, diffusion. Okay, go ahead.
But the reason we need cognitive diffusion, I'll explain it in a minute, is because ACT would say that we get fused, like stuck to ideas about who we are. And they don't talk about it in the context of racism. I was the first to really think about an intervention around being fused with negative ideas around racism, but they would use just general content around, like, say you're a kid and you're made to feel like you're not good enough in general, right? Mm-hmm. That you become fused with that idea. So rather than think there is that thought that I'm not good enough, or this person is trying to make me feel like I'm not good enough, or this thing happened and I don't feel good enough, you start to think I equal not good enough. So you start to think about the idea as content, as who you are, rather than the idea as context, as something that's around you. Does that make sense? Content would be, self as content would be, I'm not good enough, and that equals who I am.
Okay.
The context would be, my context is telling me I'm not good enough. That doesn't equal who I am, but that's what's being told to me.
Okay.
So and so the whole point of it is it creates some distance, kind of like I said with the internalized versus appropriated, right? If it's content and it equals who you are, how do you change who you are? But if it's context, what's around you, how you're understanding things, well, you can change that. You have some agency there. And so cognitive diffusion would say we have to separate, we have to defuse. So if we're stuck, we have to create distance between ourself and that content. So rather than I'm not good enough, I'm fused with the idea, it's stuck to me, it's, that's coming up again, that I don't feel good enough. Oh, that idea that I'm not good enough is bumping around, rather than it's stuck to me. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
In our book, Reframing Change, my co-author and I had the mantra from way back when, from a Buddhist monk: feel it, observe it, release it. That's what you're talking about. You're using terms so that people can observe it and not just feel it.
That is the essence of ACT. That is it. A willingness to acknowledge and feel,
right?
To observe and to let it go.
Right.
That's it.
Okay. So how do you apply ACT to appropriated racism?
Either one. So what I did is I created an intervention, and I started with Black women. We're now extending it to other groups that have experienced oppression. But I started with Black women and wanted to help them create that distance between themselves, that content as fused to who they are, and that content as not fused, as context, as part of what's around, but it doesn't equal who they are. And so we engage in a series of exercises, some of them, a lot of them coming from ACT, right? So they do things like they encourage you to write down the thoughts. So rather than it just being in your head, you actually write it down on a piece of paper. So that creates some distance. Practice folding that paper up and handing it to someone else. They don't look at it, but you've now handed it over.
Okay.
Things like putting it on a Post-it note. And this is where, honestly, I'd be so curious your thoughts. I had a lot of older Black women in particular who did not want to engage in this particular exercise because they're like, I've been through enough. Why would I tell myself these negative things? But the exercise is so that when you see it or encounter it, it does not have the same stimulus value. It does not impact you in the same way. If you see it when you're brushing your teeth, when you're riding in the car, on your computer, when that thought of I'm not good enough comes up, you're like, I saw that and was able to put that down when I was brushing my teeth. But if we don't ever encounter it until it comes at us from someone else or from a place in society that really impacts us, we sometimes have a reaction that we're not able to manage. And so the idea is, in a way, to become habituated. You kind of just get used to that idea so that you can say, there's that idea, rather than there's that idea and crying in the corner. But a number of older Black women that I worked with were like, they were like, no, I have been through enough in my life. I am not telling myself that negative content. And they didn't see that distinction between encountering it so that it doesn't get at you. They didn't want to engage. So I'll stop there. Curious your thoughts. And there's some other exercises I can share.
I encountered that it's so many times with the clearing emotions exercise. Feel it. Why should I feel it? I don't want to feel it. I need to put it away. And so what I say is, what you don't control controls you. And so either you learn to control it, or you be driven by it without knowing that you're being driven by it. And I use the snake, you said habituated. I use the snake phobia example. If you're scared of snakes, then every time you see the word snake behind, and you jump. If you see a snake, you jump. People talk about snake, whatever. You can't watch a movie with snakes on it. So everywhere you go, there are going to be snakes, and it's going to run you. If you slowly, and I talk about the research on this, which I'm sure you're aware of, you slowly bring the snake closer and closer and closer until you can tolerate the snake and tolerate it closely. Now that snake doesn't haunt you. And you can go to a movie about snakes. You can go to a museum that has snakes. It's no longer controlling you. And so
Exactly.
the way to control a thought is by embracing it first.
Exactly. So you got it. I can see why the ACT idea and why the intervention resonated with you, because it's very similar. And that's what I think it's great, right? Everything that's old is new. Many of the approaches that we have in therapy are repackaged and repurposed, and ACT is a newer approach, but as you shared, it pulls from different faith traditions, from different perspectives. What you just shared, kind of like exposure therapy, right? That we're exposing ourselves to the content. That's all part of it. One of the other exercises that we do is the inner bully. And so you think about the way in which that content might bully you or push you around or keep you from reaching for, like, who are you to want that? Or who, you can't do that, right? Whatever it would say. And they encourage you to really externalize your bully, give it a name. What is it wearing? What does it sound like? What does it look like? And in that sense, when that comes up, you can then talk to your bully. Again, it's about creating distance, right? So my inner bully is Kanye West. When Taylor Swift won the award and he got up and was like, "This Beyonce should have gotten this. You don't deserve this." And so I can see that inner bully and hear it as Kanye and just be like, "Kanye, have a seat." And now, given especially current day, there's so many reasons to tell Kanye West to have a seat, have several seats. But that then again, creates distance. My bully isn't just this voice that I like cower to. I can say, "Kanye, hush, go sit down."
Okay, so you can do that. Okay. And Kanye will go sit down. I mean, you can literally in a moment, in a tense moment, you can push Kanye West away and it works.
Well, it creates a moment, right? I'm caught up in that voice. And then I'm like, this is just Kanye talking. And it gives me a moment to then feel and not react and decide. So it creates, it's that cognitive diffusion. It creates space between myself and the content. So it's a moment of awareness that then allows me to decide, am I going to be driven by this? Like, am I really going to be driven by Kanye West? No. And so it just interrupts what could escalate.
Right. I get that. Okay. So you're saying that it gives you just enough space, just enough distance, even if it's a second, for you to then not just be caught up in it.
Right.
Okay.
And that fits with the research on a lot of different topics. Like it makes me think about the bias literature. You know, people say, "Oh, I don't have a prejudice bone in my body." We all do. We all have prejudices. We all have biases. It's how we manage them. And so it's not that we want to be, or that we can be truly rid of all of our biases, but we can create that moment of awareness that it's operating and then decide if we're going to let it drive our behavior, that the attitude is different than the behavior. And so I feel like it's similar, that the inner bully exercise, those sorts of exercises create that moment of awareness where you get to choose how you're going to act and engage. So kind of like the snake, is it going to drive you, and are you going to be caught up in fear every time? Or can you choose to be like, it's just the word snake. It's not an actual snake. And I can survive this.
Okay. So I'm about to ask you a question that a lot of people are going to hold their breath for your answer. You ready?
No.
Should people, she says she's not ready. Should people feel bad if they have a stereotypical thought or if they have a prejudice? Is that something to beat yourself up about?
So I would say, similar to what you shared earlier, was it the Buddhist tradition, right?
Right.
Of feel, observe, and was it release?
Yes. Right.
Yes. Should you feel bad? Yeah, you're narrowing, you're like thinking of people as narrow ideas and monolithic. But should you hold on to that feeling? No. Right. So I want you to have some feeling of like, oh, why am I holding that? But then move on, because if you don't move on and you say, oh, I'm a bad person and I shouldn't have that thought, and get caught up in the shoulds and all of those things, then you're making it about you. You're not making it about deconstructing the bias.
How cool. It's appropriating oppression instead of focused on the oppressed group that you're having this negative thought about. Oh, it's about now, it's about me. Oh, that's so cool.
So that's my thought. Like, you can feel bad, but don't hang out there.
Right. Guilt is useful if it prompts you into action.
Not if it paralyzes you and it leads you only to paralysis. So I shared with people, be like that duck, let it roll off your back. Like, you can have those emotions, but don't stay stuck there.
Okay, so your ACT intervention is the series of exercises you've described too. Can you give us one more so we can get a sense of it?
What other one? Oh, we show some videos that are very ACT specific. One of the metaphors, ACT is very much into metaphors and stories. And one of the metaphors is passengers on the bus.
Mm-hmm.
And it talks about how our thoughts are like passengers on the bus. And that in reality, we are driving the bus, but those thoughts make us feel like, they're telling us where to go and that we're not driving well. And so it's, again, helping you realize that, like, you can choose the direction that you want to go. And there are thoughts that might get on. They might stay on a long time. You could ask them to get off. You could ask them to go to the back and be quiet, that you have some agency. And so the reason I like this, I like this metaphor that is very ACT specific, has nothing to do with racism, but I pair it with Fry's birdcage of oppression metaphor. And so Fry is a feminist theorist who talks about oppression being like a bird in a bird cage, and there's all the different bars of the cage. So sexism, racism, patriarchy, heterosexism, those are the bars that are keeping us in. And what it would say is that, of course, we want the cage to be open up so the bird can fly free, right? But my thought is, yes, we want the bird to be free. But in the meantime, we don't want the bird to be engaged in such learned helplessness that when the door opens, it refuses or thinks it can't fly. We don't want the bird to have banged their head against the bars so much that they are literally damaged and cannot fly. And so it's not about being okay with systems of oppression, but it's about how we have some agency and can thrive in the midst of it as we work towards our liberation.
Whoa, that's Fry, F-R-Y?
Frye.
Frye. Okay, I've never heard that metaphor before. That's a great metaphor. Okay, so you've given us some exercise. I'm getting a picture of what ACT is, how it's used, how you have applied it to appropriated racism, if I can get these words out.
You got it.
Okay. How you use it. Set up the scenario. Who are the people? What's the
Whoever.
Yeah, where do you get them? Is this in your classes? Is this in some volunteer organization? You put an ad in the paper. Where do you get the folks from? How long is a session? Just give the structure of how you do this.
Yeah. So we take people wherever they come from. And actually now I should have the website ready. I think it's ridlab. I'll have to look. That's a great question. I don't know if you can do show notes. I can share with people how they could be a part of it. But you also can go to my website and you can see it, kirabanks.com. But so we take people from wherever they come. The article that you read was in partnership with a community organization that was all about empowerment and liberation. And we ran an ad in their newsletter and people signed up. We've done it on college campuses where students from certain, different student groups signed up. So the first pilot was mostly community folks who chose to give 90 minutes of their time. Oftentimes they did not want to be done in 90 minutes. They wanted to stay later over 6 sessions. And so it was a time for them to come together. It was really beautiful. It was very intergenerational, and that we had some older women, younger women. It was intersectional. There were a number of folks who identified as queer, and we came together over a series of those weeks to do the different exercises. So now we are piloting an individual intervention that is 3 sessions. So it's just one-on-one with a participant. But I wonder, we'll see if we see the same results. I wonder if there might be something important about the group format.
Yeah, the synergies between members. So do you have white, male, straight? Okay. Do you advertise in a way to say you only want people who've experienced oppression?
I think the way that we have it worded is for people of color who are interested in learning how to cope, ways to cope with racism and live healthy, liberated lives. So we say people of color.
Okay. So you explicitly say that. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And how often do you run these groups?
It varies. So we haven't run a group for a while because it's been hard to get a number of folks who are available at the same time for a group. But we just had 3 people who were available for a group, and we were thinking about starting one up. So we try to run them every semester, but it really just varies. We've mostly been running individual sessions because we haven't been able to get a group of people at a common time.
Okay, so my brain is clicking. This is what I do. And I'm thinking that you have been doing this with people of color and applying it, but it might also be useful for white people, white women who worry about whether they are, they worry about their stereotypical thoughts. They worry about whether in their hearts they're racist. I know a number of people like that.
I don't know if it would be directly applicable in that way. The reason I say that is because you have to think about them feeling guilty about being racist is not really a fused idea. It might be an idea that they're struggling with and navigating. But for white folks, I thought you were going to say something about the gender piece and about the lies and myths that get told about being a woman. But for white folks, I actually think that there's an opportunity. And I started collaborating with someone around this to talk about the ways in which they become fused with ideas of superiority. So those are the stories that they get.
There we go.
Yeah.
And that's probably what's underneath some of it. Yes.
Yep. Yep. So I'd say that's the work that they would need to do. And it's not that I'm not interested in that work. It's that I'm more interested in making sure that that bird in the bird cage is well. So I do think it's an interesting question. And it's one that I think needs to be tackled, because we often don't talk about ideas about superiority. We often are more willing to talk about, and I think in some ways are, in a twisted way, kind of enamored by the stories of struggle and poverty and strife. And so we're willing to look there, and we're not always willing to look at the flip side.
Explain that.
That I think in our society, we sometimes focus on, when we talk about inequities, we focus on the people who are most impacted and that experience. But I think sometimes we are voyeuristic about people's experiences of inequities, and we over focus on their negative experiences. And we don't look at the flip side of why is that happening, which is systemic, which is structural, which is also because they're groups, whether it's around race or gender or class, that are being told that they're better than, that are getting more access to resources, more opportunities. And we want to sit there and feel sorry that someone had a negative experience, but we don't want to also shine a light on the way in which we have set up systems and practices that have privileged some groups over another and given some groups advantage. That's an uncomfortable conversation for us to have. And so just as willing as we are to talk about the myths and lies about Black people who are lazy or incompetent, I think we should also talk about the myths and lies of white equaling right, of white equaling beautiful, of white equaling smart and without fault, and all the ways that we shape whiteness as superior.
Yeah, I so totally agree with you. 2 days ago, my church group did Healing the Heart of America. We did something on a presentation on The Sum of Us by Heather McGee, with a focus on how white people were disadvantaged by racism. And one of the things we talked about was the Brown versus Board of Education decision was all focused on the harm to Black children. But there was an appendix, as you may know, that was a brief that was filed that talked about the harm that was done to white children in terms of them unrealistically having an assessment of their capability as whites. And so that harm and the lack of critical thinking and all that. So we talked about that.
Yep.
And that's something that does not get addressed.
Absolutely.
And I can well understand you're saying I want to deal with my people who are stuck in the cage and not people who are in a different cage and don't know they're in the cage.
Yeah. And it's not that I don't want to, it's that in terms of because I do that plenty in my consulting work. It's more for my research and intervention. I feel like I really do want to try to use some of the tools and strategies that we have in the field of psychology to address the harm of racism. And that harm of racism does include the harm to white folks. But in terms of like the focus of my work, it's been consistently around racial identity for Black youth and trying to understand when and how, because we know that not all people who experience discrimination are depressed or anxious. And so let's understand like what makes them resilient. Where can we lean while we do the larger work of stopping discrimination, because that would solve it all. Where do we lean to try to interrupt some of the negative effects of discrimination?
Sure. And I want to say for those listening that research requires that you narrow your focus so you can go deep in the subject. And so you could not cover everybody in every ethnic group, and then at the same time really go deep to understand this phenomenon that you're investigating. So I get it. I understand why you're focusing as you do. It's aside from any personal interest, it's a requirement of research.
It is. It's a limitation. It's a choice. And yeah, hopefully someone else will take up the same question in different ways. And that's why we put out our research, right? So other people can pick it up and riff off of it and play off of it and build on it.
Yes. Okay, so I have one more question that has intrigued me. I'm looking at your article, and okay, I don't know if I'm going to be able to say this. Racist event, low self-esteem, depression, or whatever. Your research says, so if I'm asking people to picture a flow model, I should go left to right. Racist event, you know what I'm trying to explain, right? Racist event, internal appropriated oppression, and then what's the dependent variable? Depressive symptoms or
depressive anxiety and stress symptoms.
Yes. Okay, anxiety and depression. I'll make it simple. What you found, which totally knocked me out, was it wasn't straight from the racist event didn't just automatically lead to these anxiety and depression. What was required, and correct me if I'm saying it wrong, was you had to first have the appropriated negative experience about oneself.
So our research didn't explicitly run that, what we would call a moderation analysis,
yes.
Right? But it hints at it. And what you're saying is backed up by other research and some of my other research. I don't know which article you were referring to.
This is interrupting internalized racial oppression.
Okay, so yes, that one didn't run the model of moderation, but I have previous research and other people have done research to suggest just what you said, that it's not a one-to-one, that someone can experience discrimination and that doesn't lead necessarily to depressive and anxious symptoms, that there are other variables that intervene, there are other variables that influence. And one of those might be, we didn't have enough people to run the true moderation analysis to know if this is the case, but one of them might be the more that you've appropriated or internalized racism, that could make you more susceptible to when you experience discrimination, experiencing those depressive and anxiety symptoms. And that's part of why it's important for us to understand these different variables in people's experiences, because if we find that that's the case and we can interrupt and mitigate the appropriated oppression and appropriated racism, then we might be able to keep someone from experiencing the deleterious negative effects of discrimination, because we're still in the place where we haven't stopped all discrimination. So we've got to figure out how do we buffer, how do we protect people from the negative effects?
Yeah. The reason this is so fascinating to me is because I sense a change in myself from racist events, these micro inequities, people saying stuff, it's like, it's a knowing thing. It doesn't seep into my soul the way it used to when I was younger. And one of the questions I get asked all the time is, what do you do if somebody says something crazy to you? How do you handle it? How do you keep it from seeping in? And my response is, so I'm going to take you. If I said to you, that's an ugly red shirt you have on, you would say, I don't have on a red shirt. What are you talking about? It wouldn't seep into your soul that I'm criticizing you because you're wearing a red shirt, because it's absolutely not true. You do not have on a red shirt. So when people say those things to me, there's no part of me now that gets hooked. I don't believe it. And so I brush off the fly as opposed to sinking into depression and anxiety because they made this comment. And so what's important then in your work, why I love it, is you have techniques for helping people release from those internalized feelings. So when the racist events happen, the micro inequities, the boss says something stupid, you don't just then sink into depression. It's me. I mean, you have agency, as you said.
Yes. And we have research to suggest, my dissertation research found that for Black college students who had an awareness of racism. Race was central to who they were. They had an awareness that racism was happening, but they didn't really, their ideology wasn't that I need to assimilate, I need to be like white folks, right? They were better able to not experience individual depressive symptoms in the context of racism. Whereas the folks who race wasn't essential to who they are, and they were really, their ideology was, I need to assimilate, I need to be closest to white as possible. They were most susceptible to experiencing depressive symptoms in the context of racism. And so
No kidding.
Yeah. And so what that tells me is that we need, and what I've done with my children is I need to make sure they understand racism and that is about something else, not about them. So like you said, that's that red shirt. Like they were told we have red shirts. We're not wearing red shirts, right? Like I had my oldest son, he was playing a baseball game and we're in St. Louis City. We were playing kids in the county. It's more white in baseball out in the county than it is in the city, although it's predominantly white baseball in the city as well. The kids would not high five the kids of color on their team. They weren't just Black kids. And afterwards, I told my son, I said, that wasn't about you. His parents, someone in his life have told him lies about who we are and told him lies that he's better. And so don't you own any of that because that's on him. That's not about you. He doesn't even know you.
Whoa. But one of the variables in your dissertation you're telling me was also, I want to be closer to whites. I want to be accepted, that's a variable that kicks in.
It was an ideology variable from the Sellers multidimensional inventory of Black identity. So it's a racial identity measure that looked at multiple dimensions of identity.
We're getting jargon. Remember,
yes, we are.
We got to be careful.
Okay. Well, you asked, and I should be mindful.
Okay, just break it down. That's all I'm asking.
It's a part of racial identity that is ideology. How do you think Black people should be? Okay. And these people said, I think Black people should assimilate. And I didn't just look at that variable. I looked at other variables. It was 7 different parts of identity, but that's a short version.
Okay. So I'm going to look up your dissertation.
Please. It's in the Journal of Black Psychology. It's been published.
Journal of Black Psychology. Okay. I also have access to dissertation abstract. So I
can send it to you. Just remind me.
That's fascinating. So what do you most want people to know?
I most want people to know that we have agency to liberate our minds, even as we might not be fully liberated in terms of our systems and structures. And that doesn't mean that we should be okay with or complacent with the fact that we haven't liberated ourselves in terms of systems. But it doesn't have to be sequential. It doesn't have to, we have to wait for that to happen before we can take care of ourselves and psychologically liberate ourselves, that it can be in tandem.
Okay. So we don't have to wait for situations to change before we take care of ourselves and learn how to monitor and release any negative emotions we don't want to have.
Yes. And that doesn't mean that we are complacent and okay with what's happening, but it means we are taking care of ourselves.
Okay.
And also collectively.
All right. Thank you kindly. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. It's been a great conversation.
Yes. My major takeaway from our conversation is reaffirmation that we can indeed move past our negative thoughts about ourselves. I know so many people, myself included, who get bound up in telling ourselves that we don't have what it takes. Those of us who grew up with those negative messages about our race or gender or whatever can find it difficult to stop those thoughts, but all is not lost. We really can move past all of that. Approaches exist for this, including the one Kira has painstakingly developed, and she has the research to show it works. The essence of it is to notice those messages and distance ourselves from them. I love the idea of just writing it down and passing it off, getting it away, or give a name to the internal bully and tell that bully to leave us alone. If you can recognize that these beliefs are put on us by society, then we can better distance ourselves from it. Those of you who are familiar with leading consciously skill sets know that what she's talking about is a form of clearing negative emotions. Kira and I had a small difference. I generally use the term internalized oppression. She instead prefers the term appropriated oppression. As a reminder that these thoughts were put on to us by society. At the time we were talking, I didn't want to take up time to reflect on this difference as possibly a semantic difference. Now, upon reflection, I'm wondering if it's an individual difference. For her and others, it's easier to get rid of a negative thought if they think of it as appropriated, something put on us by society. For me, I actually find it easier to get rid of something if I believe I have control of it. If I internalize the negative thought, if I picked up messages from society that are in me, I can get them out. Whether you choose to call it appropriated oppression or internalized oppression really doesn't matter. What matters is that you know that there's technologies available to help us all get rid of those negative thoughts so we can all live more wholesome, happier lives. Hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. Please check out Pathfinders on our blog. And we would also love it if you would subscribe to our blog. Feel free to share this conversation. And thank you for listening.